A quiet meeting in Washington may be setting the stage for the biggest shift in global resource power in decades. The United States is launching a massive push to control critical mineral supply chains. And the key question is what Washington ultimately wants to achieve with this. Lithium, cobalt, graphite, rare earths. These are the materials that run the modern world, from your phone to satellites to advanced military systems. And whoever controls these supply chains controls the future of industrial power. And what's happening here could define the next decade of industrial competition. The scale is staggering. 55 countries representing roughly 2/3 of global GDP gathered in Washington to secure access to these resources. For the Trump administration, this is about restoring American industrial strength. In geostrategic terms, it may signal a coordinated Western effort to reshape the balance of resource power. Europe is already moving in step, and if this initiative succeeds, it could permanently redraw the map of who controls the foundations of the global economy. So what exactly is unfolding here? Who stands to gain? And what does it mean for Europe? Let's dive in. Hi, and welcome back to Geopolitically Correct. I'm Yannick Scheidegger. So at the center of this push from Washington lies a simple strategic reality. China dominates critical mineral supply chains, or as US Secretary of State Marco Rubio put it.
The goal here is very simple. We all understand that having a reliable global supply chains and critical minerals and processed and finished materials are critical to everything we do. As I pointed out in my opening statements to the group, and I think this is a broader mistake made by the industrialized and developed world, as we all sort of fell in love with the design of these things, but forgot that in order to design something, you have to be able to build it. And in order to build it, you have to have the fundamental materials necessary to make it with. That's the key goal of a critical mineral supply. And today it's heavily concentrated in the hands of one country. And that lends itself to, at worst case scenario, being used as a tool of leverage in geopolitics. But it also lends itself to any sort of disruptions, like a pandemic or anything that could, political instability or anything that could happen. And so it's key and important, and I think there's a growing global recognition that we need to have supply chains for critical minerals that are reliable and diverse across the world.
So in his words, supply is heavily concentrated in the hands of one country. And without naming it, it's clear he's referring to China. And this makes sense. Mining and processing of critical minerals is really dominated by Chinese companies, and where, as we know, the government is often behind them. China leads in mining and processing of critical minerals. The country mines roughly 60% of world's critical minerals and processes a much larger share, in some cases up to 85 to 90% of global refining capacity for key elements like rare earths, gallium and germanium, for example. And this is the deeper reason behind Washington's new alliance building effort. With this initiative, they want to reduce this structural overdependence on China. This goes back to 1 year ago, when US policymakers began to realize just how deep their dependence on Chinese critical minerals had become. Let me explain. After Washington sharply increased tariffs as part of its so-called Liberation Day measures, many countries rushed to negotiate. China did not. It was one of the few actors capable of responding in kind. What followed was a rapid tariff escalation between the two largest economies in the world. But tariffs were only one part of this escalation. Another response from China was that Beijing tightened export controls on rare earth minerals to the United States. Beijing introduced new licensing requirements for heavy rare earths exports and expanded approval rules for products containing Chinese rare earths materials. And suddenly, Washington realized how dependent and thus vulnerable they have become over the years on Chinese rare earths, or in general on critical minerals. Washington's response is now clear. diversify supply chains, and anchor them among politically reliable partners. And briefly, when we talk about critical minerals, we mean minerals that governments classify as essential to economic and national security, and whose supply faces significant risk. For example, we have here lithium, which is used in batteries and electric vehicles. Then we have rare earth elements, which are essential for electronics and defense systems. Cobalt, crucial for energy storage. Gallium and germanium, which I already mentioned, and they are indispensable for modern semiconductors. Different countries maintain official critical minerals lists. For instance, the United States Geological Survey publishes a US critical minerals list. The European Commission maintains the EU's critical raw material lists. And just also to mention for your understanding, mineral becomes critical when it meets two criteria. The first one is high economic or security importance, and the second one is high supply concentration or geopolitical risk. That combination transforms what otherwise might be ordinary raw material into strategic assets that can shape global power politics. And this is exactly why the US is pushing for this critical minerals alliance with like-minded states to reduce strategic vulnerabilities and build supply chains that are diversified and politically reliable. It also fits in the broader context of US geopolitics. If we go back to January 2026, so this year, in Venezuela, the Trump administration signaled two things. First, a reaffirmation of the Americas as a strategic sphere of influence for the US. And second, how highly American policymakers value assured access to commodities like oil and minerals. So the broader geopolitical logic is the same: secure essential resources abroad to reduce dependency on rival powers. But the question remains, why is Washington pushing this critical minerals initiative now? Well, we have to understand, China's export limits on rare earths opened US policymakers' eyes. Recent restrictions are just one example of how Beijing can leverage supply concentration to influence global markets and also industrial planning. And the imbalance becomes stark when you look at the numbers. I already mentioned them. So just to remind us again, China mines roughly 60% of the world's critical minerals and processes a much larger share, in some cases up to 85 and 90%, as I mentioned, of global refining capacity for key elements. This means large parts of the global economy are dependent on supply chains that are either routed through China or shaped by Chinese industrial capacity. From Washington's perspective, that dependency is a national security issue. But with the right incentive, this can be changed within the next years. And that's what this US-led initiative is about. By the way, we also have to understand that, ironically, rare earths are not rare in geological terms, but they became rare in the West as they are very resource intensive to mine and can be costly on the environment. China's dominance emerged in the 1970s and 1980s. Western countries retreated from mining under environmental and cost pressures, and Chinese firms backed by state support and willing to absorb early losses expanded aggressively and underpriced Western competitors. The result was a slow outsourcing of industrial capacity. And what we are seeing now is exactly an attempt to reserve this drift. But how exactly does Washington plan to do that? If we listen carefully to Vice President J.D. Vance and Secretary of State Marco Rubio, I think we can see some structure in their approach. I think we see a four-part framework. First, correcting market distortions. For years, artificially low prices, sustained in part by Chinese state subsidies, have discouraged alternative producers. Mining projects in North America and Europe struggled to survive when investors cannot trust long-term returns. Washington's immediate priority is to counter those distortions and create conditions where non-Chinese producers can compete. Second, stabilizing prices to unlock investments. Extreme price swings make long-term planning nearly impossible. The new initiative therefore seeks to introduce price floors and tariff mechanisms that prevent market flooding. The goal is to create predictability, because large-scale mining projects require stable horizons measured in decades, not quarters. Then third, rebuilding domestic mining and processing capacity. This means restoring industrial capabilities that were gradually outsourced. Mining is only part of the chain. Refining and processing determine who captures strategic value. Then fourth, diversifying supply chains among trusted partners. One proposal under discussion is a preferential trade zone for critical minerals, supported by tariffs and coordinated pricing mechanisms. The intention is to anchor production across a network of reliable states. So if we take these 4 points together, it amounts to the construction of a managed critical minerals bloc. Reference prices would establish a protective floor, enforced through adjustable tariffs designed to prevent market flooding. The objective is straightforward: replace boom and bust cycles with stable investment conditions that allow Western capacity to scale. Geopolitically, the stakes are clear. The initiative seeks to reduce structural dependence on China and reinforce economic security. Whether it succeeds remains uncertain, but history offers precedent. After the discovery of major deposits at Mountain Pass, California in 1949, the United States actually became the world's leading rare earth producer within a few years. That resource base fueled waves of scientific and industrial innovation. The later retreat from the sector outsourced a measure of economic sovereignty. Today's effort is a bit to reclaim it, and Vice President Vance underlined the historical parallel also by invoking the 1970s. In the 1970s, there was an energy crisis, and Henry Kissinger's Washington Energy Conference, which helped create the International Energy Agency, was a response to this energy crisis in the early 1970s. And the comparison highlights something that gets oftentimes overlooked with the current US administration, I believe. They are not moving away from multilateralism. Well, maybe in some areas, yes, they do. But in others, they take a pragmatic turn toward multilateral coordination. The Critical Mineral Alliance is such an example. It's not an American solo project. It's a coalition effort to build resilient supply networks. Strategic competition is being paired with institutional cooperation. And the urgency is growing. Every industrial revolution has depended on critical inputs, first coal, then hydrocarbons. The current wave runs on a complex mix of minerals: copper, cobalt, nickel, silicon, aluminium, and more. Demand is rising faster than existing supply systems were designed to handle. And that pressure extends beyond raw materials. It reaches human capital as well. Today, the United States graduates only a few hundred mining engineers each year. A striking mismatch for a country trying to reindustrialize. Closing that gap will require sustained investment in technical education tied to a broader effort to rebuild industrial capacity from the ground up. On the operational level, Washington is moving along several tracks at once. Direct investment in mining projects, the creation of strategic stockpiles with their Project Vault, they announced it also just 2 weeks ago, which is targeted protection for domestic producers and the reconstruction of an integrated industrial ecosystem. Early partnerships with companies such as MP Materials and Lithium Americas suggest that this shift is already underway. And over all of this is the central concern of Chinese usage of sustained oversupply to depress global prices and discourage competitors. The US response to this will combine, as I mentioned, tariffs with price stabilization mechanism designed to create a predictable environment for private capital. And the US administration is moving fast again. As one official put it, the era of writing reports about critical minerals is over. The focus has shifted to execution. Permits approved, projects financed, infrastructure built. I think it is fair to say that Washington is attempting nothing less than a rapid restructuring of the global mining landscape. What stands out most is the shift from deliberation to intervention. US policy is moving decisively toward active industrial strategy. Equity participation in mining firms, accelerated permitting, coordinated trade measures, and large-scale stockpiling. It represents a clear departure from decades of laissez-faire assumptions and signals the return of state-backed industrial policy. And that leads directly to the central question: what does this transformation mean for America's allies and especially for Europe? Washington is signaling that it wants partners, and Europe sits at the center of that strategy. US Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick made that unusually explicit. He described Europe as a continent of 450 million people with a 20 trillion economy, then added a blunt warning.
Our view of Europe is an amazing continent, 450 million people, $20 trillion economy, but they have to stop smashing themselves on the head. Right? They've got to figure out how to produce their own power. They can't have rules that stifle innovation.
So Europe should stop, in his words, smashing itself on the head. The provocation contains a strategic compliment. Lutnick was pointing to Europe's enormous latent power. The old continent still hosts world-class industries and advanced manufacturing ecosystems, but potential alone does not translate into influence, of course. The message from Washington, therefore, is clear in my opinion. Align regulation with growth, unlock investment, and Europe can remain a central pillar of Western industrial strength. And crucially, the United States wants that outcome. They don't see the transatlantic alliance as a zero-sum contest between allies. Washington sees prosperous partners as a force multiplier. We have to understand that. A stronger Europe strengthens the entire Western position in the global competition over technology and resources. Europe's presence in Washington reflects that recognition. So at the summit, the EU and 13 member states attended because the stakes are immediate. For Europe, the initiative offers two strategic gains, reducing structural dependence on China and deepening cooperation with partners in a sector central to economic and national security. In my opinion, what we are witnessing is the rise of alliance-based industrial policy. Supply chains are extensions of security partnerships. This cooperation is, of course, also not frictionless. Some European governments question the long-term predictability of US industrial policy, and maybe rightly so. Building integrated supply chains requires trust, confidence, that access will hold in moments of crisis. And it signals something larger as well. Globalization itself is evolving, and advanced economies are drifting from a single marketplace toward block-based industrial ecosystems organized around trust and security. Maybe that's one signal of this US-led initiative as well. Europe's real decision is how much influence it will or it wants over the rules that will govern this alliance. It is a moment where states must decide whether they intend to adapt to a changing order or actively build the one that replaces it. And that is the real story unfolding behind the headlines. Thank you very much for watching and listening. And if you're interested in one of my other analyses on geopolitics, click right here. See you there.